President Trump believed his latest tactic, attacking Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett personally, would be enough to sideline the heat from the oversight hearing. But when she slowly flipped open that yellow folder, revealing classified documentation tied to irregular government spending on DNA testing, the stage was set for a confrontation that would not only shake his administration's foundations but unveil decades of hidden financial engineering linked directly to his youngest son. The hearing chamber radiated sterile intensity under the unforgiving fluorescent lights. Every angle of the polished oak table gleamed beneath the bright overheads. A low mechanical hum from the AC filled the air, blending with the scent of stale coffee and new paperwork. Somewhere in the room, a mobile phone buzzed briefly before being silenced. Around the perimeter, media cameras cast an invisible heat, while their operators waited to capture every flicker of emotion. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at attention, serene and commanding. Her navy blazer, sharply tailored, framed a pristine white blouse, and her square-rimmed glasses gave her an intellectual sharpness few could match. Resting her hands calmly on a closed yellow folder, her demeanor was the embodiment of poise. No dramatics, just controlled fire waiting to be unleashed. Across the aisle, President Trump surveyed the room with a cold, rehearsed confidence. His suit, deep navy with a blazing red tie, projected power, defiance, control. His fingers, always in motion, tapped rhythmically on the wood, impatience barely contained. He wasn't a man used to answering questions. He was used to setting the tempo. And then there was Barron Trump, 19, refined, almost spectral in his composure. Wearing a tailored gray suit with a crisp blue tie, he watched the proceedings with an unreadable expression. His presence alone was unusual. The leather portfolio on his lap twitched in his long fingers, a small gesture but telling. Not boredom, nerves. Every corner of Washington's hierarchy had turned up. Congressional aides whispered into ears. Reporters leaned forward with anticipation. Staffers typed without blinking. Cameras rolled. History was being written. Then Crockett's voice, crisp and exact, pierced the background noise. "For the record, I'd like to introduce document 457B, she announced, lifting a paper from the folder with surgical precision. A report from the Comptroller General, requested by this committee half a year ago. The president's posture shifted, only slightly, but enough for seasoned observers to note the crack in his otherwise immovable facade. The smile, ever present, faltered. He watched the paper as if it were a live threat. An almost physical weight fell over the room. Silence settled so heavily it pushed against chests. No one moved. Even the air conditioning seemed to whisper less as Jasmine began to speak, her tone calm, deliberate, and laced with the authority of someone who had come prepared. Before her role in Congress, Crockett had carved her name into Texas's legal history as a civil rights lawyer who never flinched. The daughter of a schoolteacher and an engineer, she grew up on stories of dignity wrestled from struggle. As a public defender, she saw the gears of power crush the voiceless. As a legislator, she battled resistance from entrenched forces. Now, as a congresswoman, she stood at her most defining crossroad. A flashback unspooled in her mind, just the night before, sitting alone in her office under the blue light of a desk lamp. A whistleblower's call had just landed explosive files. In her hands, information that could implode the legacy of the most powerful family in America. "Are you sure you want to go there?" her chief of staff had asked, eyes clouded with concern. She had stared at the old photograph of her grandmother marching with Dr. E. Gingen and replied without a tremor. "When truth knocks, you answer." Back, in the chamber, Crockett's voice rang clear. "This committee exists to ensure the proper use of federal funds," she stated. "For 6 months, we followed a trail of diverted money, over $300 million redirected from the Department of Health and Human Services into an unnamed genetic research project." A ripple passed through the gallery. Cameras zoomed in as Barron shifted again just a fraction, but the subtle change in his breathing was caught. His gaze locked on Jasmine now, intense, yet strangely open. Crockett flipped to the next page. That money was funneled into a program called Project Legacy, allegedly for rare genetic disease research. But what we found is that this technology, developed with public funds, was privatized and transferred to companies connected to the Trump family. President Trump barked out his objection. This is another hoax, witch hunt garbage. There's nothing improper here, Crockett, unmoved, countered smoothly. The records state that your family used this tech for personal DNA testing at no cost. Conveniently, those tests occurred just before your son's admission to NYU. The camera cut to Barron. A crease appeared between his brows. His expression, normally glacial, betrayed the flicker of recognition. My son has no role in this, the president snapped, his voice brimming with force. This is between me and you, not him. Then you deny that Project Legacy ran advanced DNA tests on your son, Crockett pressed. Tests subsidized by taxpayer money and the resulting technology sold to your private biotech firm, grossly under market value. At that, Barron opened his portfolio and slowly pulled out a document. He didn't speak. He didn't move much. But the tightness of his grip, the subtle inhale, said everything. Around him, the room buzzed with the quiet tension of the inevitable. Crockett continued. We have itemized allocations showing $17 million spent on compatibility tests conducted within the exact window of your son's university medical assessments. No response came. The silence from the president's camp grew louder than any denial. Jasmine took one step further. Mr. Trump, she said, looking directly at the young man, I do not presume your involvement. My intent is not to harm you, but to expose a system built on silent entitlements. For the first time, Barron seemed to truly listen. His head tilted, just enough to mark the shift, and Jasmine's tone softened, an olive branch across enemy lines. And just then the president leaned forward. This entire proceeding is a fantasy, he hissed. My son earned everything on his own. We don't need help from the government, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Then why, she asked, do financial records show Project Legacy not only paid for these tests, but also donated to NYU the same month your son was accepted? Barron Trump looked up, right at her. The high-aware, silent fire in his eyes was no longer confusion. It was something far more dangerous, awakening. President Trump shifted uncomfortably, his fingers pressing hard into the polished wood of the hearing table. The room seemed smaller now, heavier. Crockett's words had landed with surgical precision, each one peeling back layers of secrecy that had cloaked the administration for years. But she wasn't finished, not even close. If these are just allegations, she said, her voice calm but carrying the gravity of cold evidence, perhaps you can explain this next piece of documentation. She slid another paper forward. The room seemed to lean in with her. This memorandum, signed 3 years ago, authorized the exclusive use of Project Legacy's DNA analysis technology for what it called priority family testing. And that signature right there, she pointed without looking, is yours, Mr. President? Trump scoffed. I sign 100 things a day. This proves nothing. Jasmine's reply came without hesitation. This wasn't standard paperwork. It required your personal review. And it was signed on the very same day your son completed his university admission physicals. Barron adjusted his tie, barely. But for a young man groomed to remain composed, the movement spoke volumes. Cameras caught it. Analysts would replay it later in slow motion. A Republican ally of the president, eager to intervene, leaned into his mic. Madam Chair, we're wasting committee time on baseless spectacle. Congresswoman Crockett is clearly using this forum for political theater. Jasmine turned unbothered. I appreciate the concern for time, Congressman. Then let me be direct. We have hard evidence that $300 million in taxpayer money was diverted into a program that funneled proprietary genetic research into the hands of one family, the president's. Trump leaned back, arms folded again, jaw clenched. His son, however, didn't move. His blue eyes stayed fixed on the woman who now held the room like a conductor with an invisible baton. Mr. President, Crockett continued, the American people deserve to know how a program developed for rare disease research ended up subsidizing your family's business interests. If time is of the essence, then perhaps you'd like to admit what you knew about Project Legacy and when. Before he could respond, the president's attorney leaned forward, a smug grin crossing his face. Representative Crockett, perhaps. The complexity of federal finance is overwhelming. These line items can often be misinterpreted. Crockett smiled faintly. As a former public defender and civil rights attorney who once managed municipal budget reviews, I assure you, I know how to read these numbers. My only question is whether the American public will understand why their tax dollars created technology they can't afford, but which your client's family profits from. A few murmurs from the audience broke the silence, but Jasmine wasn't done yet. She pulled out a new exhibit. These internal emails, she said, lifting the stapled packet, show that several lead scientists questioned the redirection of resources. They raised ethical alarms about private use of government-funded advancements for something coded only as Subject B. She glanced deliberately at both men across from her, father and son. Trump shrugged. Scientists always complain. That's their job. Even when they're instructed to prioritize testing for a subject whose samples are flown under presidential escort to federal labs, she asked, without blinking. Barron's face hardened. He reached into his portfolio and removed what looked like identical correspondence, the same emails. This time the tightening of his lips was more than subtle. It was purposeful. President Trump raised his voice. This is political fiction. She's drawing imaginary lines between unrelated data points. Jasmine placed another document on the table like it weighed 1,000 pounds. This is a security memo confirming those samples, Subject B, were sent to a classified facility with full presidential escort. And the dates align precisely with your son's medical evaluations for NYU. Trump started to speak, but this time Barron shifted in his chair as if ready to rise, only to sit back down. The cameras didn't miss it. Neither did Crockett. She didn't let up. Financial records show your company later made a $10 million donation to the university, 3 weeks before your son was accepted. Gasps broke out among the spectators. A staffer dropped a stylus. The cameras zoomed in on Barron's hands, his knuckles white against the grain of the paper he held. My son is brilliant, the president snapped. Are you suggesting he didn't earn his place? I'm stating, Crockett replied, that federal funds paid for proprietary technology used to your son's benefit, and your company later acquired that technology for pennies. Whether or not he earned his place is irrelevant. What matters is how the public paid for tools used privately. The silence was back. Tense. Uncomfortable. Thick. Then, in a move that seemed to crack the very air, Jasmine said softly, and we have one final report from Project Legacy itself. A summary of advanced compatibility testing conducted on Subject B. Cost to taxpayers, $17 million. Purchase cost by Trump Biotech, $5 million. Even Trump sat back now, stunned into silence. These tests, Jasmine continued, help determine specialized treatment protocols now only accessible through private channels at astronomical costs. And those treatments were built on public funds. Barron stood, no warning, no preamble. He rose to his feet. His face showed a storm of emotions, grief, confusion, strength. May I speak? He asked. His voice didn't tremble. It echoed. The room froze. Reporters held their breath. Phones stopped moving. Even Jasmine Crockett seemed caught off guard, just for a second. Trump's head turned slowly. Barron, he warned, low and sharp. But the young man didn't flinch. Whatever had been contained within him now brimmed at the surface, demanding release. And with every camera trained on him, Barron Trump stood ready to speak. Barron Trump stood tall at the edge of the spotlight, his calm posture drawing in every eye. For years he had been the quiet silhouette behind headlines and handshakes, a presence, never a participant. But today, in the most watched room in the country, he stepped forward with the weight of 1,000 hidden truths in his grasp. President Trump turned sharply to his son, a storm rising behind his controlled expression. You're not the subject here, he said firmly, hoping to regain control with a father's command. But Barron didn't sit. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, never one to miss a shift in tempo, recovered from her surprise with composed grace. "Mr. Trump," she said, addressing him not as a son or a symbol, but as a citizen with agency, "this committee would value your input if you wish to speak." Her tone wasn't coaxing. It was respectful, empowering. Before Barron could respond, his father intervened again. "My son is not part of this circus. He is here only as an observer. These accusations don't even deserve a response, let alone his involvement." Crockett held her gaze steady, sidestepping confrontation. "We are not questioning your son, Mr. President. We are investigating the allocation of $300 million in federal funds. However," she paused, "if your son has relevant information, this committee is duty-bound to hear it." She reached for another document. "When you authorized the use of Project Legacy technology for compatibility tests on your son, were you aware those tests would cost the American public $17 million? She asked quietly, her voice striking at the very structure of presidential responsibility. Trump scoffed, waving her off. "This is fiction. I never authorized that. You're connecting lines that don't exist." Without missing a beat, Crockett slid a paper toward him. "Then perhaps you can deny this memo, marked confidential, with your signature authorizing continued use of legacy technology, specifically for Subject B, with classified results." Trump stared at the paper for a long moment before shaking his head. "I sign hundreds of documents. My team handles the details. You can't expect me to recall everything." Crockett leaned in, gently pressing. "So you're telling this committee under oath that you signed a memo allocating millions in federal funds without understanding what it was for?" The trap had closed. If he claimed ignorance, it was incompetence. If he admitted knowledge, it was confirmation. And then, breaking the moment with clarity that stunned the room, Barron finally spoke. "Representative Crockett," he said clearly, voice carrying across the hushed chamber, "I would like to clarify something. Everyone, cameras, reporters, aides, froze mid-motion. I have evidence that may be relevant to this investigation," he added, pulling out a slim folder from his portfolio. Trump's face turned toward his son, disbelief mixing with unease. "Barron," he said, almost pleading, but Barron wasn't looking at him. He was looking straight at Jasmine Crockett. "I was unaware that my medical assessments for college admissions involved technology developed with federal funding," he said. "Nor did I know that my family later acquired that technology for private use." A stunned murmur ran through the gallery. Still, his voice didn't waver. "But I recently found these documents, and I believe the American public has a right to the truth." The president rose slightly from his chair, lips parting for an objection. But Crockett stepped in, capitalizing on the moment. "Mr. Trump," she asked, "are you saying you had no knowledge of how your admission to NYU was arranged?" Barron nodded slowly. "I believed I earned my place. Until I received this. 2 weeks ago." He held up a sheet, an internal Project Legacy report showing how his genetic profile was synthesized and delivered to the university prior to his acceptance. "My son is confused," the president said sharply. "These papers were planted by our political enemies. This is all fabricated to divide my family." Barron turned to him. "No, Dad," he said, quiet but firm. "We both know that's not true. I found these in your office. I overheard your staff discussing how to contain the legacy situation." The tension in the room became suffocating. Faces that had remained stoic now cracked. Journalists blinking faster, aides whispering to one another, lawmakers shifting in their seats. Congresswoman Crockett softened her tone again. "Mr. Trump," she said, "can you explain what these documents reveal?" Barron exhaled slowly, grounding himself. "They show that my DNA was used to create a highly specialized genetic profile," he said. "That profile was shared with NYU. It was also used to develop targeted treatments now held exclusively by my father's company." He placed the documents onto the committee table. "I didn't know, but now I do, and I can't ignore it." The president's voice cracked with outrage. "That's enough. This hearing is over. My son is being manipulated by Democrats, used to stage a media stunt." Crockett didn't even flinch. "Mr. President, Your son seems capable of speaking for himself. And the evidence he's shared aligns with everything our investigation uncovered. She turned again to Barron, her tone deliberate. What made you come forward? The question hung in the air like a breath waiting to be exhaled. Barron looked out at the audience for the first time, at the cameras, the notepads, the eyes watching his every move. I grew up believing that hard work got you ahead, he said. That merit mattered, but learning that my acceptance may have been aided by technology paid for by taxpayers and then hoarded by my family changed everything. His voice grew stronger. I didn't earn that, not fully. And thousands of other students with better grades, better stories, they were rejected. He looked at Crockett, something unspoken but deeply respectful passing between them. And millions of Americans who helped fund this technology will never see its benefits because it was taken for profit. The room remained frozen. Not even the soft clack of a keyboard could be heard. Across from him, President Trump looked stricken, his expression a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something else. Fear. The fear of a narrative he no longer controlled. President Trump's mouth was set in a hard, unreadable line, but his eyes betrayed something rare: uncertainty. He opened his mouth to respond, to reframe the moment, to reclaim authority. But nothing came. No rebuttal, no insult, no denial, strong enough to contain the truth echoing from his own son's voice. And Barron stood unshaken. Crockett didn't press. She didn't need to. The stillness was heavier than any words she could deliver. It was the kind of silence that comes when the veil finally falls, when the illusion collapses. Then she asked with careful restraint, Mr. Trump, can you elaborate on what these reports reveal? Specifically about the nature of the genetic data used in your treatments? Barron adjusted his grip on the folder in front of him. They indicate I possess a rare genetic variation, one that enhances certain cognitive traits, but also presents medical vulnerabilities. My treatments were custom designed using that knowledge. He paused. Those treatments are now exclusively licensed by Trump Biotech. They're not available through public health services, only to those who can pay. His voice was calm, but the weight of the injustice it carried thundered in the room. Cameras zoomed in. The press typed furiously. This wasn't just a personal revelation. It was systemic exposure, an American son unmasking the very mechanisms that had privileged him. Across the room, the president leaned forward, clinging to his last defense. This hearing is a setup, he snapped, regaining some of his bluster. My son is young. He's being exploited by partisan forces who want to dismantle everything we built. But Crockett again refused to engage in theatrics. Her words were ice over fire. Mr. President, she said slowly, your son came forward of his own volition, and the documents he shared directly support the timeline, the financial trail, and the ethical breach we've uncovered. She turned to Barron. What drove you to step into this room today? The cameras turned, as if the entire nation leaned in with them. Barron looked directly at her. Because I couldn't stay silent. I found emails, invoices, reports, all confirming that the tech developed from my DNA was paid for by taxpayers, then sold to our family's company for next to nothing. He looked around the room now. Not afraid, just awake. I grew up hearing that we earned everything we had, that we were different from the others, better. But that wasn't the full story. He glanced toward his father. I didn't choose this advantage, but I can choose what I do with it. President Trump cut in louder this time. This is a witch hunt using my son to stage a betrayal. These accusations are built on emotion, not facts. Crockett responded with steel. We didn't bring these documents. Your son did. Then she addressed the entire committee, rising slightly from her seat. The evidence we've seen today isn't just about financial misconduct. It's about public property being funneled into private hands. It's about meritocracy manipulated by influence. And it's about a young man who chose truth over legacy. For a moment, even the opposition lawmakers sat in silence. But the president made one last push. He rose to his feet, voice raised to meet the boiling pressure of the moment. My family never needed government handouts. My son was accepted because he's brilliant, because he earned it. Crockett's voice sliced through his fury. Then why, she asked, did NYU receive a $10 million research donation from your biotech firm 3 weeks before your son's acceptance? Trump faltered. No answer. No escape. Barron, watching. His father closely stepped forward again. I didn't know about that money, he said, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. I've met students with better qualifications, students who were rejected. His gaze swept the room. This isn't about tearing my family down. It's about owning the truth. Crockett nodded, slowly letting the weight of his words settle. Mr. Trump, she said, the integrity you've displayed today is rare, especially here. The silence that followed was not empty. It was reverent. Until the president, voice low and bitter, spat, he's just a boy. He doesn't understand the stakes. Barron responded without hesitation. Maybe I understand more than you think. The room shuddered beneath those words. Then Crockett raised the final document. It bore the seal of the Department of Health. Her voice never wavered. This internal memorandum, she said, shows Project Legacy was redesigned 3 years ago to focus exclusively on elite profiles. That timing coincides precisely with your son's first genetic tests. She flipped to the last page. It includes a commercial valuation of the technology at $1.7 billion. The price your company paid to license it, $5 million. Gasps echoed through the chamber. No one spoke. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, the document in hand, and looked directly at the president. This isn't just financial misconduct, she said, voice lowering to a resonant hush. It's the theft of public innovation, sold off for private gain. And then she looked at Barron. Mr. Trump, she said gently, would you be willing to tell the committee what those tests revealed? Barron's hands tightened on the edge of the table, his jaw clenched. The world was watching, but he didn't blink. They revealed I had traits for advanced cognition and vulnerabilities that required unique medical care. He inhaled deeply, and the treatment developed from that profile, which could help others, is locked behind corporate walls. His final words hung in the air. I didn't choose these genes, but I can choose to stand for transparency. The moment Barron Trump finished speaking, the hearing room held its breath. For a long beat, no one moved. His confession wasn't just startling, it was seismic. A rare moment in American politics when the truth wasn't shouted over. It stood tall, unwavering. Across the aisle, President Trump's face had hardened into a mask. Not of strength, but of disbelief. Betrayal lingered behind his eyes, shadowed by the dawning realization that the narrative he controlled was slipping. Fast, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett allowed the silence to stretch. She understood its value, how words, when left to echo, could reverberate longer than any speech. But the hearing had to continue, and she wasn't going to let it end on hesitation. Mr. Trump, she said calmly, addressing the president, your son has testified to what he found. Documents, transactions, genetic data, all pointing to a misuse of public funding. Trump didn't respond. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked as if the words he wanted to say were being swallowed by force. Crockett pressed on, not with aggression, but with a tone carved from unshakable resolve. The American people deserve to know whether their resources funded not only advanced genetic technologies, but also the selective gatekeeping of those discoveries, locked behind patents for private wealth. Still no answer. Then, unexpectedly, she turned back to Barron. Mr. Trump, in your opinion, who should benefit from this technology? The young man didn't hesitate. Everyone who helped pay for it, the taxpayers, families with children suffering from rare conditions who are now priced out of the very treatments their tax dollars helped develop. The room shifted again, not just in silence but in sentiment. Some committee members leaned forward. Others looked at Barron with an expression rarely reserved for the powerful, respect. And just then, the president made his move. He rose from his seat, shaking his head slowly, jaw set. "Enough," he said with finality. "This hearing is over." He turned to leave, motioning to his lawyers, who scrambled behind him, but Crockett remained unfazed. "Mr. President," she said, not loud but with razor-edge calm, "one last question." He paused. "This genetic testing, did it uncover information you preferred to keep confidential? Information about your son that, if revealed, could change public perception?" Trump froze in place. The question wasn't shouted. It was carefully designed. A soft dagger. Barron looked at his father, something fragile stirring in his expression. Not rebellion, something closer to sorrow. "That insinuation is vile," the president said, turning slowly. But his voice lacked the defiant punch it once held. There was a tremble beneath the surface. Crockett didn't raise her tone. "Normally, I would agree. A family's medical history should remain private. Except when $300 million in public funds were used to obtain it." She turned once more to Barron. "Would you care to answer?" The room collectively inhaled. And then Barron, standing tall, voice unwavering, said the words no one expected to hear. "The tests revealed that I have a rare genetic profile, one that predisposes me to heightened cognitive processing. But it also comes with increased risk of neurological instability. The treatment I've received has stabilized it." He paused, letting the room absorb that vulnerability. "That treatment, built using my data, now belongs to a private company. Our company. It could help others, but it doesn't." His honesty hit harder than any accusation. President Trump exhaled sharply, like the air had been pulled from his lungs. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale. For the first time, the room saw him not as the unshakable titan of the GOP, but as a man, cornered by reality. Barron continued. "I didn't ask to be used in this way, but I refuse to be silent now that I know the truth." The cameras clicked like mad. Every angle was being captured. Social media was already exploding, and just then, Crockett delivered her final blow. Not as a gotcha, but as a call to conscience. She raised the last document, one she had saved for this precise moment. "This memo," she said softly, "from the Department of Health proves Project Legacy was altered 3 years ago to focus on elite genetic profiles, right after your son's test." She placed the page down with delicate precision. "A valuation of $1.7 billion, she continued. "Sold to Trump Biotech for $5 million. There was a pause. "What we're looking at is not just financial misappropriation. It's the commercialization of public science. Sold to the few, denied to the many." She turned toward the president, then locked eyes with his son. Truth doesn't become less true just because it's inconvenient. A bolt of silence swept through the hearing room, and then, in an act of sheer moral clarity, Barron responded, not defensively, not as a son or as a Trump, but as a citizen. "Privilege isn't about having more. It's about taking what should be shared." His words were a quiet detonation. Not loud, not cruel, just deeply true. And the contrast was unmistakable. On one side, a woman who fought her way through the courts to stand for justice. On the other, a young man raised in luxury, now standing against the very system that sheltered him. Together, in that instant, they stood on the same ground. The president tried once more to reframe it. "This is staged. My son is being exploited." But Barron turned to him and said with profound softness, "No, Dad. No one manipulated me. I found the truth myself. You told me I earned everything, but this wasn't earned, it was arranged." A silence thicker than politics followed. There was no fury, no shouting, just the sound of one father being confronted by a son's unshakable clarity, and a country watching it unfold, live. The hearing room, once electric with tension, now felt weightless, suspended in that rarest of moments when truth overpowers theater. President Trump sat frozen. The authority that once commanded entire news cycles now eclipsed by a single, unyielding voice. His son's Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, ever composed, didn't gloat. She simply turned to the committee and, with the dignity of someone who understood history was unfolding, spoke softly but with unmistakable resolve. The documents presented today, she said, are not merely about financial misconduct. They expose a systemic failure, a pattern of privatizing innovation paid for by public funds. This is not an attack on one family. It is a wake-up call for a nation. No rebuttal came from the president, no thunderous denial. He had already exhausted every deflection, and Barron, his own flesh and blood, had spoken a truth that could not be spun or sanitized. Crockett looked again at the young man who had changed the course of the hearing. "Mr. Trump," she asked, her tone now one of genuine respect, "what do you believe comes next?" Barron didn't hesitate. "I believe technology developed by taxpayers should serve them, not enrich a few. What my family did was legal, but it wasn't right." He took a steady breath. "So I'm starting a foundation. Its mission will be to ensure that any innovation funded by public dollars, especially in healthcare, remains accessible to the public." There was a pause. He wasn't done. No one chooses their last name. But we do choose what to do with it. The weight of those words settled across the room like dust in sunlight. Quiet, but impossible to ignore. That evening, news networks ran wall-to-wall coverage. The most played clips? Crockett's line about inconvenient truths and Barron's statement on privilege. Commentators across the spectrum were stunned. For once, the story wasn't divided by party lines, but united by something rarely seen in modern politics: moral clarity. Inconvenient Truth and Dad's Project Legacy trended globally. Moderate Republicans, caught between loyalty and conscience, called for a review of Project Legacy. Democrats, wary of seeming triumphant, praised Barron's courage and Crockett's composure. Even late-night hosts set aside satire to acknowledge the gravity of the hearing, and then the ripple widened. The very next morning, investigative reports emerged linking other elite families to similar genetic privileges, quietly funded through public grants. Bioethics panels were hastily convened. Universities faced pressure to disclose donation-linked admissions. Protests formed, not loud or violent but persistent, organized, morally grounded. Barron Trump, who once had no public voice, became a reluctant symbol of reform. He was no longer just the youngest Trump. He was the man who chose truth over legacy. Within a week, the White House, reeling from the fallout, announced a full-scale audit of Project Legacy and its satellite programs. In a move few predicted, the administration vowed to restructure its biotech licensing model. Public outcry had made silence impossible, and in an even more surprising twist, Barron formally launched his foundation, the Trust for Equitable Innovation. Its mission statement was simple: public science belongs to the public. Standing at the press conference flanked by researchers, activists, and yes, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, he made his new role clear. "I'm not here to erase my name," he said. "I'm here to redefine what it stands for." Crockett, invited to join as a policy advisor, accepted. Her involvement signaled that this wasn't about politics, it was about principles. Meanwhile, across the country, something began to shift. High school debate teams re-examined the idea of merit. Professors rewrote case studies. Health equity became more than just a buzzword. A teacher in Georgia used Barron's hearing testimony to teach civic ethics. A mother in Detroit applied for funding she never knew existed until Project Legacy came into public view. A physician in Oregon offered a free lecture series on the moral responsibility of medical innovation. 6 months later, Project Legacy was reborn, transparent, publicly accountable, with protections to ensure no proprietary privatization of publicly funded advancements. And through it all, Barron remained committed, not flashy, not performative. Just determined. At a university commencement where he was invited to speak, he stood behind the podium, calm as ever. "I didn't come here to be forgiven," he told the graduates. "I came to remind you that dignity isn't inherited, it's earned, when you choose truth over comfort." The students rose in applause. Not because he was a Trump, but because he was something rare in politics. Authentic. Even President Trump, in an exclusive interview weeks later, had no choice but to acknowledge what had happened. "I disagree with how he handled it," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "But I raised him to be strong. And I guess that's what he was." That comment, backhanded as it was, marked a subtle shift. For decades, American politics had lionized the loud, the ruthless, the unrepentant. But this time, the hero was soft-spoken, careful, brave in a quiet way. 1 year after the hearing, Crockett reflected in an interview, "We didn't just uncover a scandal. We showed the country that integrity can still matter." And what of Barron Trump? He continued his studies in public policy, quietly declining interviews, choosing instead to build something lasting. Not a campaign, not a brand, a legacy, not one built on entitlement, but on accountability. The enduring truth from that extraordinary day was simple. Moral greatness isn't about having power. It's about how you wield it when the spotlight finds you. And as long as history is written, that moment, when a son stood against silence and a congresswoman chose precision over vengeance, will be remembered not as a scandal, but as a turning point where dignity won, and the truth finally spoke louder than power.